The views and opinions expressed in the following program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of KSMQ Public Service Media Incorporated or its assigns.
Thank you for joining us on Farm Connections. I'm Dan Hoffman. Some of you have heard of our speaker tonight, outspoken personality in support of agriculture, Trent Luce. On my far right, welcome Trent.
Thank you, Dan.
And on my right, immediate right I should say, Ruth Merrick from Minnesota Farm Bureau. We're honored to have both of you on the panel tonight discussing our topic, which is Tell Your Story.
Can I mention the last time I was here I complained about not having a Farm Bureau mug, and now I got a better deal. I got a Farm Bureau person, Ruth.
We listen to you.
Whining, complain. It works. It works.
We got
Have your
the
voice
message.
heard. That's the point of the story. Have your voice heard.
Tell your story. Excellent, Trent. And with that, Ruth Merrick of the Minnesota Farm Bureau, what exactly do you do for the Minnesota Farm Bureau?
Well, my job with the Farm Bureau is to work with 13 counties in southeast Minnesota. I pretty much cover I-35 to the Wisconsin border and 494 to Iowa. And it's to work with the county volunteers on developing programs and that work towards educating the public, whether it be legislatively or going into the schools, teaching consumer ed programs, working with different ways that we can communicate agriculture story to the general public.
Well, excellent. That sounds like very much a full-time job.
It's a full-time job. It changes every single day. I feel extremely blessed to be doing the job that I get to do, and that's working with those that produce our food and fiber.
And you do it well. I've had the opportunity to be on a farm where you sponsored not only and put together the food, the agenda, and got some good educational programming. I was very impressed. Actually, too, Minnesota, it was Breakfast on the Farm near Adams with the Beeson family. Also on the Jim Checco farm, you had something with Morrow, Minnesota Agri-Leadership. So you really do outreach into many different organizations, don't you?
I do, and again, like I said, my job's ever-changing. But really the credit doesn't go to me. It goes to the volunteers that are always out there in whatever vehicle or means that they can to tell the story of agriculture and what they do.
Thank you, Ruth. With that, Trent, we're going to talk about telling your story. How do you do it? You actually have several venues and several media sources you use to help people tell the story of agriculture, but elaborate on that if you can.
I started talking to myself in the shower, and I got tired of listening to myself, so I was seeking other audiences. And that's very true, actually. I do produce 6 radio shows every day, Monday through Friday. I have a venue on Dish Network, a television show, and write in columns, 2 different publications, Feedstuffs magazine and the High Plains Journal each week. And you know, the one thing I really want to address, Dan, is that as I travel this country and this year already have spoken in 29 states, it's frequent that farmers, ranchers will come up to me and say, you know, I really want to get out there and I want to tell the story, but I don't have the gift of gab that you do. And I think that far too many times, all of us, whether we're in agriculture, whether we're an automobile mechanic, whether we're a medical researcher at Mayo Clinic, we are an expert in our own experiences. And people today get so hung up in their own little world that unless we're directly involved in mechanics or medical research or agriculture, we really don't know what's going on. And we want to hear from the experts. And the experts in agriculture are the men and women, the children, who every day get their hands dirty converting natural resources into human consumable products. You are an expert in your own experiences. Just share your experiences. And you don't need a podium. You don't need to stand up in front of church. You hear people misspeak about what you do every day. Just set them straight. And it will be very empowering to you. And the tools that Ruth and everyone at Minnesota Farm Bureau make available are there to assist you in gaining the confidence to simply tell your own story. It's that simple.
We talked a little bit about that at lunch today, and how everybody is an expert in jobs that they've done for a long time, and people involved in agriculture, whether it be my brother who's farmed our farm for several generations, or my neighbor, how often do they go out and tell their story? And sometimes, unfortunately, it's not very often, and we need to do a better job with that. Everybody else is going to tell their story, and if we're not on the front line doing that as well, we're really missing the boat. I've had the opportunity to work with Trent on other opportunities, and his audience is always varied. And it doesn't matter who you're telling your story to, whether it be high school students, college students, adults, maybe people that were involved in agriculture years ago that are no longer involved. We need to continually work to tell that story about what we're doing in agriculture and production agriculture, how people's food and fiber is being produced. If we're not doing that, we have no one to blame but ourselves.
Excellent points. Ruth, I grew up on a farm in southeast Minnesota near Dexter. I watched my father work. I worked beside my father and my mother. I mean, when it's a family farm, it's really a family farm. Everybody gets involved. So for me, I wonder, why doesn't everybody know how food is produced? And why don't they understand how difficult it is and the kinds of things that are involved to bring food from the farm to the kitchen table or to the restaurant? Why doesn't everybody know these things?
I think what happens is that people become so comfortable in their own lives that they just really take things for granted. Those of us that are involved in it, and you know, I grew up on a farm not too far. Riceville, Iowa is where I call home. My mom still owns a farm. She's going to be passing that on to my brother. We know on a day-to-day basis because we live it. But you know, no more do I know what the auto mechanic's doing at the auto shop as far as working on the cars, because I'm not involved with that. So for him to tell his story, do you understand how I'm making the connection? I don't understand their story because they don't tell it to me. If we aren't telling our story about what we do, and people are disconnected, it is easy to go to the grocery store. It is easy to go down to the farmer's market and buy what we need to take home. When that becomes more difficult, people will understand or want to know why they can't get that pound of hamburger or that gallon of milk. That's when they're going to choose to become involved, when it becomes more difficult to get. So I hope that makes sense, but it's because it's everywhere, it's abundant, it's affordable, so people just go get it. And when it becomes, if you go to, I have a daughter that's adopted from Guatemala, and I went to the markets there, and I visited the grocery store there, and I've been to Argentina with the Marl program and Chile, and to see what's on their shelves versus what's on the shelves back here at home, it really brings it home about the abundancy and the affordability of our food. Like I talked about at lunch today, I am a single mother, and I work very hard at my job, and I don't want food to be any more expensive than what it is today. I have a family budget that I have to meet on a month-to-month basis, and when prices change in the grocery store, generally that's where I start asking a few more questions. What's going on in the dairy industry? What's going on in the beef? Even though I work with it day to day, it's important for me to understand that as a consumer, not as someone who's involved in agriculture. Really, it's both, but more as a consumer and as being a mom who's bringing home that food to my family.
Great points.
Dan, if you realize it's your show, but if you let me emphasize something to a greater degree that Ruth said, I think we're in an unprecedented time in American culture where we have people disconnected from the farm and agriculture, but want to know what's really happening on the farm. And largely that's what's driven the growth in farmers markets around this country. We have more people going today to the farmers market. It's because they want to know the person behind the production of food. I don't know what percentage of American consumers actually purchase their food at the farmers market. Some estimates are around 4%. But the point that I want to make to our farm viewers is that when the consumer wants to know who you are and what it is that you do, if you're not the one explaining what it is that you do on your farm every single day, somebody else is going to tell them what you're doing, and that person may not have your best interest in mind. So today it's vitally important that all of us stand up and share our personal experiences and what it is that we've accomplished in the conversion of natural resources into human consumable products, because there's somebody else wanting to say what you're doing on your farm, and we need to be the voice of that information on what we're doing on our farm in Dodge County, not somebody at a farmer's market that may not have our agenda. I'm not saying people at farmers markets don't have agriculture's best interests at heart. I'm saying there are people that want to mislead and change the future of food production in this country. And that's where the danger truly comes, because who listens? Policymakers. And when policymakers make and enact regulations based upon misinformation, it leads the American society down a path of struggling to have a supply of domestically produced food at a reasonable cost. Exactly what Ruth was saying. We should celebrate the successes of the most affordable, reasonably priced food of any global consumer in the world. Case in point, you remember the peanut butter salmonella scare. Do you know how many people got sick from tainted peanut butter? Less than 80. And it was major news. We had pandemonium for a couple of weeks about something that caused 80 people to get sick. In developing countries around this world, there are people that wish they could have some tainted peanut butter because at least they would have enough nourishment. My point is, our food is so safe that when we have a recall or we have something happen, it's newsworthy because we just automatically make the assumption that it's going to be there and it's going to be safe. It is safe. We consume 1 billion meals a day in the United States, 365 billion meals a year. CDC says that we have 76 million cases of foodborne illness. I'll take those odds any day, Dan.
I have a couple points just to kind of pull off what Trent said about the disconnect in agriculture. I get the great opportunity every year to work at the state fair and work with the fairgoers that come in and out of the Farm Bureau booth. And I remember a few years back, I had a teacher come in, and we had all these different commodities in the raw state available for teachers to take a look at. And I remember having this conversation with the teacher and allowing her to feel the different grains. And the teacher picked up a handful of soybeans, and she looked at that and she goes, "Soybeans. So these are soybeans. I've never seen soybeans in my life." And as a person involved in agriculture, works with on a day-to-day basis, and everybody knows how great the amazing soybean is, it's just like, wow, you know, she had no connection. And my other point is, and that was a great opportunity for me to go into the benefits of agriculture and the nutritional value of soy and soybeans and kind of that whole, so grasp that opportunity when it presents itself is one point. The other thing is, my daughter came home from a farm tour. I think she was in kindergarten, and she visited a dairy farm. Now, I am involved in agriculture every single day. I think my kids know a lot about farming. But I really missed the boat because when my daughter came home from school that day, she looked at me and she said, "Mom, do you know where milk comes from? It comes from a cow's body." We can't forget educating our own sometimes too. And that's just a small example, but there are lots of people involved in agriculture, and unfortunately, we're not all riding in the same boat. So we do need to work together, especially to tell that agricultural story.
It sounds like you're doing a great job with your family. I recall a program with the FFA I used to work with in Montgomery, Minnesota. It's Food for America. Our FFA officers would bring in the young people from the elementary school, bring them into the ag shop, show them livestock, show them what they ate, and talk to them about that. And then they'd also go in the classroom and talk about Food for America, the program, and how food was raised on farms. And they came back and said the same thing. "Mr. Hoffman, some of those kids thought that cereal came from the store or milk came from the store. They didn't realize that it came somewhere before the store." What a wonderful job you're doing with your family, plus Southeast Minnesota. You each talked about safety of food and hit on affordability. What percentage of the average disposable income gets spent on food in the United States?
You know, I used to know that statistic.
Less than 10% in the United States. And the interesting thing about that, and recently, I think we've got a great case study. 2 years ago, we heard about food shortages. You know, corn was $7 a bushel. That led to people talking about, oh my goodness, food prices are going to skyrocket. Well, if you were buying corn, feeding it to livestock, you thought they did skyrocket. But do you know that in the grocery store, that calendar year, we still spent less than 10% of our disposable income on food. Case in point, very recently we had a wheat situation where Russia announced on a Friday, due to drought and severe drought over an extended period of time, Russia was not going to send any wheat into the export market. They're going to keep it all domestically because their wheat crop is going to be so short. Our wheat prices skyrocketed on that particular Friday that announcement came out. Wheat closed at $8.41, pretty high. Over the weekend, there was a forecast of rain in Russia. It didn't rain. There was a forecast of rain, and on Monday, wheat bottomed. But my point in bringing this up is that just during that weekend, restaurants around this country and the National Restaurant Association came out with a release that said, consumers better get ready. Wheat prices are skyrocketing because of a problem in Russia. Well, I did the math. Do you know of a loaf of bread, $1.89 for a loaf of bread? What percentage of that cost is attributed to the wheat in the bread? Less than 12%. And a $2 change in the cost of wheat sold from the farm to the elevator only has a 6-cent per loaf of bread increase. So if you look at the big picture about what American agriculture has accomplished, we've accomplished a supply of affordable food at a reasonable cost. When you have a loaf of bread that has less than 12 cents wheat in it, it means the farmer has done his job. The rest, by the way, is in packaging and transportation and all of the things that we've been able to accomplish. And in the big picture, we do all of that very efficiently. It's just that the farmer has led the way in making this plentiful supply of food very available. And again, I want to remind you that if we think that we can continue to allow the restrictions to make it tougher for United States agriculturalists to continue to farm and just rely on Russia and South America and being Brazil or even Africa to supply our food needs, look what happened in our country in a 3-day period with the threat of a drought in Russia. And then the forecast of rain in a 3-day period, our bread prices fluctuated. Let's not rely on foreign food supplies. Let's make sure that we are giving the tools and not unnecessarily increasing cost of doing business for the United States farmer so that he can continue to feed 310 million Americans very efficiently and cheaper than any other citizen in the world.
I think Trent makes a very, obviously a very valid point about food production in the United States. And as a person involved in agriculture,
Can you say but? Surely you're going to follow with a but, Dan.
Yes.
Good.
We do not want to have, obviously we have to have some imports, but to rely on foreign agriculture to feed our nation. We know that American farmers produce a very safe food supply. And I think, again, it goes back to food safety. What are they doing in foreign countries that we don't do here as far as crop protection and making sure that we have a very quality product?
Is that a question?
No, it's a statement.
Yeah, well, we don't know.
You want to answer that question, though? That was a statement, right?
I like answering questions that were ultimately statements. We don't know, and that's your point.
That's my point.
Why should we worry about what they're doing to milk products in China when we know that we implement the utmost in safety and handling standards in the United States?
And we have USDA and Minnesota Department of Ag people inspecting our plants and holding our producers to standards that maybe they can't enforce on foreign soil. You talked about...
In all fairness, if I were a USDA guy, I would be telling you, but we have an agreement with those countries that they tell us that they're implementing the same measures of protection in that food supply that we implement here. But the CDC has reported that less than 2% of the food that's imported into our country is actually inspected. So 2%. Our point, yes, 2%. So our point is that while we do have a safe food supply, whether it's domestic or not, why should we worry about what they're doing in China to their food when we have that resource available here as American consumers ask the question, where did it come from?
And we're so capable here. And earlier, Trent, you talked about one cow producing $13,000 of economic development times the number of cows in an area. So we really need to do this. Agriculture is one of the bright spots in economics right now in our country. You also talked about affordability. If we were to look at $1 being spent on food in the grocery store, what amount of that dollar goes back to our farmers? Any idea?
It's different with each particular commodity. I used the most extreme example earlier with wheat in a loaf of bread. It's approximately 10%. On the high end are meat products, and give or take, the numbers are going to be around 20% of the consumer's food dollar that actually gets back to the producer.
Thank you. And oftentimes the packaging of our food products takes more of our consumer dollar than actually the grain or the products or even the dairy products going into that food, which is a little bit interesting.
It's not just the packaging, it's obviously the marketing. I was in Arizona last winter, and I could buy like 4 bundles of asparagus for like 99 cents. And back here at my grocery store, one bundle was like $2.99 or $3.99. I can't remember exactly. But there's also the transportation costs that are involved with that, and it isn't just one factor that makes our food costs. Obviously, there's lots of them. I want to pull this back a little bit about telling your story. And Trent, I'm going to add a couple things here. We talked about why it's important for people involved in agriculture to go out and tell your story. But if you've never done that before, and like I was afraid to come on the show today.
You were?
Maybe.
Why? You're so comfortable.
Maybe some person involved in agriculture wants to go out and start telling their story, but they don't know how. They don't know where to go. They don't know what to talk about. Let's talk a little bit about that. I've always been told to be proactive, to be passionate, to talk what's within your comfort zone, and maybe there's some things that you can add to that as well.
Farm Bureau has the resources available if you want to take those resources and walk into the 3rd and 4th grade class and say, I'm a farmer, here's what I do, here are some things that will assist you. And you know what? At the end of the day, what you provide through Farm Bureau, Ruth, what the Ag in the Classroom is doing in resources is nothing other than giving you the confidence to go do what you were going to do anyway. And once you stand in front of a group of 3rd or 4th graders, you become empowered because they're all wanting to know the question. A great case in point, a friend of mine in the local area, Ron Durst, is as good as there is at bringing kids, and maybe that's where your daughter went to the dairy, brings the kids to the dairy. I don't know, maybe 4,000 kids a year that go to Durst Dairy. And Ron will walk them through all of the safety checks, the 7 times that milk is checked for antibiotics from the time it's milked until it's actually sold in the store, to make sure that everything is implemented and it's safe and it's going to be as wholesome as we can possibly get it. But what does the 3rd or 4th grade kid remember from the entire event? Your daughter, what does she remember? The farmer. And the next time that the kid sees that particular farmer in the grocery store, they'll say, Mommy, that's my farmer. We can talk about science, we can talk about technology, but it's the human element that resonates with people. And the fact that you stood up in front of a group of 3rd and 4th graders, that you stood up in your community meeting, you stood up in a permit hearing, it's the human element that matters to people. So the tools that you make available through Farm Bureau, Ruth, are nothing other than the confidence builder so that you get started. And once you get started, that avenue will be so empowering to you that you'll say, they really just want to know what I want to do. A quick final story, because I realize you've taken over the show, but for 10 years, Dan, I've been trying to find the right way to tell the science on how efficient modern food production is. And we take great studies from the University of Minnesota, one of the fine land-grant institutions in the nation, and we take a 17-page science report. We try to condense it into a bumper sticker to explain modern food production. And accidentally, earlier this year, we, being myself and Sarah Muirhead with Feedstuffs, who I'm partners with on Feedstuffs Food Link, we developed an A through Z Children's ABCs of Farming coloring book. And to date, we have put over 12,000 of those coloring books out into the public, and every letter corresponds to something in agriculture and how that letter and that bit of agriculture improves human lives. And that doesn't include the people that can go on the website feedstuffsfoodlink.com and download the PDF file themselves. So my point is that so many people in agriculture think that, oh, you know, I didn't go to college, I really can't speak to people. The basics, simple basics on what you do every day is what people want to know. Just tell your story. You're an expert in your own experiences.
I remember the first time that I had the opportunity to go into a St. Paul school to talk about agriculture. And back then, I was just a Farm Bureau volunteer. And I worked through the Department of Agriculture to go in and do one of the Ag in the Classroom programs. And I remember thinking I was young and I had not been exposed to the whole program. And what in the world was I going to do? And so I utilized the Department of Agriculture and the Farm Bureau to gather some resources. But then I just kind of walked around my farm. And I got some hay, and I got some feed, and I took some pictures, and I even got a heat lamp. And I put all this stuff in a box and I took it into the school. And my message was simple I gave them lots of hands-on. I gave them things that utilized their senses. I plugged the heat lamp in and allowed them to feel the warmth of the heat lamp, and why, you know, sometimes we have little pigs that need a heat lamp. And they were just amazed with that. And the message was very simple, but it drove home that connection. And then I, you know, had a few items that I connected to what they may have had for breakfast that day, to what we were growing on the farm. And at the end of my presentation, I remember asking them, and now again, we're in South St. Paul in a school, how many of them would like to be a farmer someday? And how many of them raised their hand? Every single student in that classroom raised their hand. So I'm hoping, and I'm pretty sure I had an impact that they will carry for the rest of their life. Again, the message doesn't have to be complicated. It can be very, very simple. And I think, you know, obviously I would love everybody to be a volunteer member in Farm Bureau, but there are other organizations to get involved with too. The Minnesota Agri Leadership Program, the different grassroots farm organizations. There are a lot of organizations that are willing and capable of training people. In fact, Minnesota's just starting a Speak Up Corps, where volunteers can be trained to not only go into classrooms, but to go into civic groups and other organizations to talk about the value of agriculture.
Ruth, excellent. How do we find out more about Minnesota Farm Bureau? Do you have a website?
We do, fbmn.org. Otherwise, call Ruth Merrick, Area Program Director for Southeast Minnesota, and you can go into a County Farm Bureau office and get my number, or work with any County Farm Bureau as well. And in my 13 counties, there's one in every county.
Awesome. It sounds like the people, the youngsters that watched your presentation, got involved, learned that farmers care about their animals, care about their farm, and care about them as people and nourishing them. Is that correct?
That is true. And we always have to remember, no matter how young our audiences are, there is the potential that they will be the decision makers in the future. Excellent
points. We have about 5 seconds, which means we have told our story, and we hope other people have.
There's only one connection to the farm. It's the farmer.
That's the farmer. Excellent point. And I hope our audience does go to your websites. Do you have a website?
Faces of Ag, A-G, facesofag.com.
Perfect. Thank you so much for joining us, Ruth and Trent.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you. For more information, log on to ksmq.org and click on Farm Connections. There you can find past episodes and participate with the blogs, where you can submit your ideas, and don't forget to email us at the show. It's at ksmq.org. You can also find KSMQ on Facebook and Twitter, another way to tell the story. Tune in next time as we continue discussing the impacts on agriculture for all of us. From everyone at Farm Connections, I'm Dan Hoffman. Thanks for joining us. See you next week. Thank you.